Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for that very generous introduction. And I think, like he said, I am an accountant, so I'm not technologically savvy at all, right? So I use computers, and I see how some use it well, and some misuse it and abuse it. But I'm not a technology expert, so I don't come up with products. I don't know the security features in them, and then I find out later that my client also don't know the security features. And that keeps me in business and has kept me in business for almost 20 years. Right? So the topic today is why cybercrime matters. Right? So technology today is so powerful. It's everywhere. You know, we were just talking about how the most important word today is cloud. Right? I've always known the cloud as cloud in the sky. It's blue, it's nice. When it's a cloudy day, I need to get an umbrella. But that was the extent of the cloud. But today everybody wants to be on the cloud. And the second word which everyone uses, and it's so, and everyone wants to use it, is biometrics. Right? So everyone talks about biometrics. They want a new biometric system. We have this Aadhaar project, which is all biometrics. There are 2 biometric projects by the government of India itself. So everybody wants to do biometrics and cloud, and technology is so pervasive. But it has to be used the right way. Right? So does cybercrime matter at all? So what I'm going to talk about is, first of all, before we get to cybercrime, what is fraud? And PwC does a crime survey, and we do a global survey every 2 years. And we select one topic in addition to some general questions. And the topic in 2011 which was selected was cybercrime. And globally we asked the same set of questions. Right from Brazil and Chile to Japan and everyone else in between. What is cybercrime? Where is cybercrime coming from? Who is responsible for preventing it? How can it be prevented, or how you should prevent it? And what are some conclusions? So what is fraud? Right? And we use it very commonly. It's the most misused word. Right from my neighbor says, oh, my security, my cook, my driver, she's a fraud, he's a fraud. We use it very commonly, right? And we attribute it as if it is a second nature, that someone's wearing a yellow sari, well, someone's a fraud. So, but fraud is essentially a combination of all of these, right? So it's a representation or a misrepresentation, and the key element on fraud is intent. Right? Intentionally and knowingly so, which is then acted upon by someone and causes damage. So what is critical for fraud is intent. And intent is in the mind. And it was very difficult to tell what someone is intending to do. Is someone intending to defraud someone, or is someone just making a mistake? So it's harmless. Is it an error of judgment or an error of intent? So that is why it is very difficult to prove what is fraud. So it takes a long legal process to prove what is fraud, because you have to go into the intent of the person. And you can infer intent through the person's actions, words, beliefs, or not acting. So the non-actions or not saying certain things, you can infer intent. And to commit fraud, there is a well-known research by a very famous psychologist, which very commonly is known as a fraud triangle. So everyone generally accepts that there are 3 elements needed to commit fraud. One is the incentive, that you need to have an incentive to commit fraud. So you either you get a increased bonus if you meet a particular target, you get an increased level of commission if you sell more than the particular target, you get an increased number of stock options if you hit a certain earnings number. So you need an incentive. So that's what motivates someone to commit fraud. The second is opportunity. So you need an opportunity, as in you need a weakness in any of the systems or controls, whether they are IT systems, automated systems, manual systems, preventive, detective. So there is an opportunity to commit it because there is a weakness in the systems. And the third aspect is the rationalization, right? So as human beings, they need something to rationalize their action. And most of this comes from, if everybody is doing it, then it's not fraud. So they feel, well, if everyone is doing it, how can what I'm doing be wrong? They don't see their actions to be wrong. They can rationalize what they're doing themselves. Or, I am entitled to it. And I worked so hard, I only got a 1% increase in salary, I should have gotten a 5% increase, so I'll take this additional 4% by submitting false expense statements. I'm entitled to that 5%. Or if everyone does it, then it doesn't become difficult for someone with that intent because they don't feel they're doing something wrong. So it's a combination of these three which contributes to fraud. And that's what's known as the fraud triangle. And recently there have been two elements added to this, and now it's become a fraud pentagon. And the elements added were competence and arrogance. So essentially for people in top level management and senior management, overriding controls. So the competence of their own knowledge and skills takes them up to the level of the CEO or the board, but then that competence and trust is then misused, which then becomes arrogance. So they've added these two more components, but that's still very early stages. But the fraud triangle is very well known. And what this shows is that in India, the largest reason was incentives. That they felt there was an incentive if they committed fraud, the possibility of getting a higher bonus, a higher commission, a higher total compensation or variable compensation. That was 43% of the people who responded felt it was incentives which drove them to commit fraud. But an equal number of them, almost 35%, said that there were opportunities. It was just too easy. Our controls were weak. I know the loopholes in my own system. So what if I had the fanciest IT system, but I know the controls were weak, and it was too tempting not to do it. And they could rationalize it because they felt they were entitled to it or everybody else was doing it. So that's just a context on what is fraud. So now I think on high risk of fraud, you'll have to, if you think you answer yes to any of these questions, that if in your own organizations you have any significant incentives or pressures, or the risk of management override of controls, or there are fraud control deficiencies, multiple remote subsidiaries, joint ventures, and they need not be in outside the country, they can just be multiple locations, or significant changes in size or management structure. So when you need particular anti-fraud controls, right? Otherwise, the risk of fraud remains high. You may not have been subjected to an actual incident, so there may not have been an occurrence, but your risk of fraud is high, which is very different from an occurrence or an incident of fraud. So the survey itself was about 3,800 respondents in almost 78 countries. There were 106 from India who completed the entire survey. There were many more who completed parts of the survey, so we excluded all of that. 20% were financial services, 13% pharma, 10% manufacturing, and then 8% was technology and 5% for automotive. So these were the industry groups.